It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Greg Dvorak. I'm a professor at Waseda University, which is, I think, one of the largest private universities here in Tokyo. I've been based in Japan for close to 30 years, if you include the time that I spent in high school. It's quite a pleasure to be here. I want to thank my dear friend Jam Akuzar, who is on the verge of giving birth to a baby boy, I believe, and also to Xyza, who wanted to be here. Xyza is up here on the big screen. You're enormous, Xyza, just so you know. You're like huge. It's incredible. Yeah. It's like a genie coming out of a bottle or something. And she would have been here, but she also had an interesting sort of dilemma with, her trying to get a green card in the United States and an interview for that, all kinds of interesting stuff like that. Ken and Julia, my dear friends who are based in Kyoto and whom I met originally in Australia. Also, their daughter is taking a very big exam to get into a university this year, and I myself threw out my back and thought that I might be having to crawl here or do a Zoom thing myself. So we've all had these various interesting crises, and I think that sort of highlights a little bit how I think all of us look at art. It's an interesting sort of panel that Jam has thrown together. And I think we need to remember, I mean, we're quite fortunate to be able to be here in person and to sit around and talk and even unmask ourselves in different ways. But we are in a very turbulent time, and this panel is about art in turbulent times. But we have thought more about our own fragility, vulnerability through the COVID pandemic, which is of course still ongoing. And I would hope that that is something that we still take to heart, that we are so fragile. I would like to start talking a little bit about my own practice. So if we could start my presentation, that would be great. Okay, so my background is, I feel a little bit awkward talking about my background when, in fact, very established artists are talking after me. I'm not a practicing artist so much as a photographer and a writer, sometimes a filmmaker in some ways. And I've also been working as a curator. But basically, my background really informs my practice. And I would like to talk about that in the sense of, I guess for many of you being leaders and thinking about sort of making connections across borders, this can be helpful in some ways, partly in my background as a scholar, but also as someone who works with the arts. My background is rather wacky. I start with these islands because I wanted to talk about how we are connected by water. Our planet is a water world. We emerged from the ocean originally. Our bodies are mostly water. And in some ways, I want to invite you to think about that. And I think maybe it relates in some ways to COVID and to the ways in which our bodies are, infected by different kinds of little creatures or whatever they are. But the Pacific has tens of thousands of islands in it, and it's a great, vast space. To oversight the often cited scholar Epeli Haofa. It is a sea of islands which is connected by water. So in many ways we tend to think about islands as places that are completely separated from each other, that are isolated, that are remote. My background in Pacific Island studies, which I'll talk about in just one moment, really informs my practice in thinking about the connectedness through the ocean that we all have, that sort of defies borders and thinks about things in a very different way. And over thousands and thousands of years, really, Pacific Islanders themselves very bravely navigated these waters and got to these islands. And that is something that is often not given very much credit. So I speak from a very decolonial space, decolonizing and thinking very much about unsettling and trying to transform these narratives. And the reason why is because I was born in the United States and I am American, but I was raised on this very small island, which is part of the largest atoll on Earth, called Kwajalein, in the Marshall Islands. And as you can see, the airstrip is very large there. It's a military base for the United States, and intercontinental ballistic missiles are tested there, as well as interceptions and so forth, and a lot of space surveillance technology. It's a very important base. It also used to be a Japanese naval base. And it also informs in some way why I am here in Japan and what I do as a scholar. For those of you who don't know, the Marshall Islands is located basically between Japan and the United States, more towards this side of the Pacific. And I don't have time to go into that, but I just wanted to briefly sort of highlight why this matters to me. So I grew up basically playing on Japanese war junk, stuff that was left behind from the war, bunkers that were built by Korean forced laborers during the war, mostly. And this was normalized, the idea of this militarization, the idea of military having been there. I was taken care of by our sort of nanny and maid, Neitari, who became sort of like my Marshallese grandmother. And she would, as an indigenous person of the Marshall Islands, teach me a lot of things about the Marshall Islands. She would sing to me songs in Marshallese, but she would also sing in English church songs, and she would sing songs that she learned when she was a little girl in Japanese elementary school, in Japanese. And so this kind of complexity really began to kind of seep into my head. But behind all of this, of course, was U.S. missile testing, and my father worked as a contractor for a company that worked with the U.S. military establishment. Now, I don't, this may be contradictory or uncomfortable for some of you who are very much about sort of security and about leadership in that sense. But from a perspective that is kind of in alliance with indigenous people who have been colonized and displaced, and I express a lot of solidarity in many ways with the last speakers. I feel that this is important as someone who was a settler to be participant in that conversation. Our presence in the Marshall Islands and displacing indigenous people led to people being kind of shoved into this shanty town called Ibai, which is very close to Kwajalein. A lot of problems there. And of course, long before that, there's the story of Palauans, Marshallese, people from Saipan and so forth, who were all sort of shoved into these different Japanese schools and trained to be good Japanese subjects of the emperor. And as you all know, there was a major war which displaced thousands upon thousands of people and killed, of course, countless people, really. And destroyed their land, though. That's another thing that we don't talk about. It completely destroyed their homes, completely destroyed their landscapes, made it impossible for them to go home. Again, normalized militarization and passed on to the next generation. This in the northern Pacific, I know that there are some of you that have come from the southern Pacific where the war didn't quite reach these levels in some places. But in many ways, northern Oceania is still a very militarized zone, and very American as well. And as a professor, I would go on to talk about these things as I have to you, and I would talk about the horrifying 67 nuclear tests that were conducted by the United States Department of Energy in the Marshall Islands. 67 tests. And I would talk about this as, and it becomes sort of like a bit of a spectacle, and people look at this and it's sort of like the sublime. Oh, how amazing. Look at all of this kind of stuff. In fact, Jam Akuzar, who has helped to coordinate this program, invited me to her art residency in the Philippines, in Bataan, to talk about this kind of nuclear testing and so forth in relation to an artist who had been doing work around this. And what I discovered during that was that people tend to focus mainly on the spectacle without recognizing all of the generations and generations of Marshallese people and people throughout Micronesia who have been affected by this and are still affected by this to this day. And so beyond scholarship, I realized I could write a book. This is my book, and it focuses very much on coral as a metaphor for settlement and movement and displacement and decolonization. The flows of coral are a lot like us, migrating and so forth. But I felt that art began to be a space that really could help to highlight and work through these struggles in a way that crosses borders and gets beyond kind of the nonsense that we've created for ourselves with many of our institutions. Art can transcend institutions, it can transcend borders, it can transcend bodies, and in some ways it is like water. And when I think about the amazing artists from the Pacific Islands, many of whom have gotten a lot of notoriety from the south part of Oceania, they've been amazing, but in the north of Oceania, they have been silenced in many ways, simply by American infrastructure that has kind of seeped in and made it very hard for artists to come to the forefront. And so just very briefly, I just wanted to say, In terms of my work, my research going and talking with different artists throughout the Pacific, this is just recently in Palau, began to lead to noticing more and more about how local artists were depicting their own struggles and their memories of trauma under Japanese militarism and empire, and American empire, and yet many people did not see these works or did not recognize them. And I think a part of it too is that in the Pacific there's a lot of ritual, there's a lot of performance that is not noted as being resistance. Sometimes silence is a form of resistance. Sometimes ritual can be a form of resisting and healing and resilience. And to notice that is not something that I want to boast about, and I don't want to be perceived as someone who just kind of profits from this. In some ways, maybe I look like a white savior, and I own that and recognize that. My work, I believe, though, between Japan and the United States is really to try to bring out this space of betweenness and to think about that. And so in recent years, I've worked to curate programs and work with different artists to try to bring their work here and to different communities, also in Australia. Something as simple as these flowers that are quite beautiful, but they're woven out of military wires that were dug out of the ground from Japanese militarism and made into symbols of peace by Marshallese women from the atoll of Woche, I believe is important art for all of us to think about. I began to work with the Honolulu Biennial, which Ken and Julia were also a part of, with an artist named Kathy Jetnil-Kijner, who's an incredible poet, a climate change activist, and a dear friend of mine. We began together to help bring Marshallese traditional sort of work into contemporary spaces to show and value the importance of indigenous knowledge. Earlier this year, I curated my first show together with a number of other curators at the Australian Asia Pacific Triennial in Brisbane, which highlighted the work and the messages of resilience of so many different artists from around Micronesia. This is a work by Kathy Jetnil-Kijner. It seems very simple, but these 4 mounds represent the 4 atolls in the Marshall Islands that were most affected by nuclear testing. Recently in Japan, I've also been working with Japanese artists to have different talks and interventions in different places that challenge nuclear testing, nuclear problems, and all kinds of things. This is artist Arai Takashi here in Fukushima, talking about these issues on site and kind of trying to talk about that stuff and complicate it. Next year, I'll be going on a mission, sort of a voyage to Bikini Atoll with 20 Marshallese artists and other artists from around Oceania as a way of going to Bikini and really thinking about that nuclear history and also really trying to make work out of it in solidarity with the people who have been displaced. I don't want to take any more time. I'd like to go on now to Xyza, but that's a little bit about me, a little bit about how I think about art, but I think we all share something about the way that we approach art. It's not such a studio necessarily, big sort of selling, amazing pieces to collectors. It's more about really trying to work with society and try to raise new questions and different kinds of dialogues. So let's go on to Ken and Julia. I'm sorry, to Xyza. They're sitting next to me, so it's hard to forget. It's easy for me to forget because I'm looking out at the audience that we have a massive Xyza Bacani behind us. Xyza, please go ahead. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi, good morning to you, and good evening from New York. So I am Xyza Cruz Bacani, and let me share screen. A minute. I hope you can see it, all right? So I'm Xyza Cruz Bacani, and I'm an artist in service. But before going to being an artist, I would like to talk about my background for a bit. So I worked in Hong Kong for almost a decade as a domestic worker, and I was a nanny to 6 children. And while working as a domestic worker at daytime, I was moonlighting as a street photographer in Hong Kong. During my free time, I go around the city to take photographs of random moments of random people, and I use my camera as a shield to protect myself from the stereotypes of working as a domestic worker in Hong Kong. When I go out, I'm not a domestic worker anymore. I'm not a nanny anymore, but I am like everybody else, just going around and seeing the city in my own eyes. But the main reason why I went out and studied photography by my own was because of my mother, who never really goes out. She's also a domestic worker in Hong Kong, and she's still there working with the same family. And the reason for me to take up a camera is because I want her to see Hong Kong through my lens. I became my mother's eye. So these are some of the images that I took. I was really young then. I think it was 2014. And luckily in 2015, I got discovered. It's a bad word. I don't like it because I don't think that anyone had discovered me. My parents birthed me, but no one discovered me or colonized me. Anyway, so in 2015, a photojournalist from San Francisco saw my works on Facebook, and she forwarded it to New York Times. The New York Times liked the story, and they did a profile on me. And that year, my life changed. From a domestic worker, I came here to New York and studied documentary photography in New York University. And as I'm staying in New York, I documented a lot of issues about migration because I am a migrant worker. My family is the family of a migrant worker, and I felt that I am in a very unique position to tell our story, because aside from being a migrant worker, I am also one of the children who was left behind by a migrant parent. This is a story about human trafficking in New York. This is Daisy, who was trafficked from the Philippines to United States, and she was promised a work in a hotel, but she ended up working as a domestic worker in the Upper East Side. This is her speaking to one of her children in the Philippines, and during that time, she had not seen her kids for 7 years. Family separation is one of the biggest side effects of migration. In the Philippines alone, we are creating a generation of migrant children who are growing up lacking affection and love from their own parents because their parents need to leave the country to find better economic mobility. And this story I've done in Singapore is also about human trafficking. And this young lady is from Myanmar. She's 16 years old, and she was trafficked to Singapore when she was 13. When I photograph vulnerable young trafficking survivors, I try not to show their faces in a way of me protecting them, because photography is power. And as a photographer, I am very aware that all the power is in me when I'm taking the photographs. And this is also another human trafficking survivor in Singapore. I also shifted from human trafficking to climate change issues, because one of the biggest driver of human trafficking in today's world is actually climate change. We are creating a lot of climate refugees as long as governments around the world are ignoring the causality of climate change. This is stories about a mother who left Malaysia because they were not able to farm anymore, and she died in Malaysia. She left for her children, and she came back in a box. I also photographed the plantations in Indonesia. And in 2018, I published my first book called We Are Like Air. We are like air because migrant workers are like air. We are important, we are a necessity, but often we are unseen. The society do not see our sacrifices. The society ignore our importance in their mobility. And so I called it We Are Like Air. I love the title. I'm high-fiving myself. Anyway, so this story is anchored with the story of my mother, Georgia. And it's also the first time that I photographed my own family. The process of creating the book is actually very cathartic, and a lot of traumas, a lot of wounds that we thought are already healed came out, and it was very painful, but also with the pain comes healing. So this is stories about my mother and my father, William Moore, whom I highlighted their love story, because I mentioned a while ago that one thing about migration is the family separation. And despite the distance, my parents decided to stay together and love each other because of their love for us. And I started the project in 2013. All the photographs are from 2013 to 2018. This is my mom and my dad. And to be honest, I also was reintroduced to their personhood, because as children, you always see our parents as someone who's like, oh, she's a mom, she's a dad. But I never realized that they're very cheesy and corny and how they love each other so much. And of course, I try to show the differences and similarities of their lives despite the distance. This is my father taking care of one of her grandchildren, my niece, and this is my mom in Hong Kong taking care of someone else's grandchildren. This is one of my favorite photos. These are 3 generations of our family. That's my mom looking tenderly towards my nieces and my sister. So in my work, I try to embrace tenderness, because in the world that we live in today, when everything is all about bad news, like all the time we're bombarded with bad news, I think it's important that we embrace tenderness. I think it's important that we look at each other with tenderness, because it makes us human. It grounds us, and it reminds us that despite all the noise of the world today, love still exists. Of course, I cannot deny the human rights violation that happens to a lot of migrant workers. This story is Shirley in Hong Kong, who was a pot of boiling hot soup was poured over her back because of her employer, and they did not pay her. They terminated her. It's a lot of legal complex issues, but I've met her in Hong Kong in 2015, and because of her photographs that I published, she was able to get justice. So for me, it's the first time that I experienced that art can actually have a direct impact to the people that collaborated with me. Of course, there's joy and delight. It's important as well that we show hope, we show delight, because it humanizes us. It shows our similarities as human beings. And this is a photo of migrant workers, Indonesian migrant workers, joining a protest in Hong Kong to fight for their rights. And I love this photo because I always feel that speaking out is courage. A lot of us speak out here today without the consequences of losing something. And for these people to speak out, they're risking their jobs, they're risking their families, they're risking a lot of things. So they are very courageous. And of course, these are also families that treated their domestic workers as human beings, as their own families, and mothers and daughters who were separated because of migration. And before you ask, I do photograph in color. During the pandemic, I was stuck in the Philippines for 21 months. And it's also a decision on my side because I thought it is the right time for me to tell the story of my people. So I was in our province and I found out that home birth is actually illegal. It's not permitted in our country. So I decided to photograph women who are pregnant and who are giving birth during the pandemic, during the early beginnings of the pandemic. So this is during a cesarean period. I was able to get access and photograph this amazing scene. I was really nervous on that one. And of course, the cesarean. And it made me realize, I know I love my mother, but I love her more when I witness childbirth. So we must all love our mothers, no matter how, what we feel about. They do really risk their lives for birthing us. And of course, I photographed nurses in the Philippines who don't have enough protection during the early days of the pandemic. They're wearing cloth masks and serving their community. And of course, I also photographed the beauty of our culture where we help each other no matter what. So this is one of the things that we did in our province where everyone is donating their vegetables so that everyone in our village can eat. So that's something beautiful that came out during the pandemic when everyone is helping each other and the beauty of community is highlighted instead of individualism. And of course, this is another photo of a lot of businesses that closed because of the pandemic. And this is my latest project that you can read on Asia Society magazine. It's about the American Bangladeshi community in New York and their perilous journey towards migration. And that's my presentation. And I want to repeat that we can all be artists in service. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Xyza. That was really, really exciting to see your work. And you know, I think that kind of engagement that's so personal and so self-reflexive, but so loving, I think is really important. It's that emphasis on care that I think really, really matters. I want to invite now Ken and Julie Yonetani to share their work and their practice.
Thanks for inviting us, Greg. Yeah, it's kind of coincidentally got invited us to here, but maybe not. And our unit name Ken and Julie Yonetani, and we are working together and in a contemporary art. And we are now living in Kyoto, outside of Kyoto, and working as a farmer, as an organic farmer as well. But we both are born in Tokyo, Japan. We are not young anymore. 1971 and 1972. It's nostalgic photos in Tokyo, in Shinjuku. I can't remember, but I grown up, and my high school in the middle of a skyscraper building, Shinjuku High, right near here, and just grown up, and then graduated university, but not visual arts. And I studied economics, and my first job in Tokyo is as a foreign exchange broker and trading the US dollars and Japanese yen in a spot desk. That's in my first year. The yen going down right now, but at the time, before the Asian crisis, the yen was so strong. And after that, I changed my life, and I changed my job as well. Accidentally, I actually went to Okinawa with Julia, and my next job is here, and working as a potter for my master. He is the eldest son of National Living Treasure in Okinawa. Working a lot of traditional Okinawan ceramics work for 3 years. After the job of working as a broker, trading $1 million, it's a big change. It's quieter and much less salary, but peaceful. And after spending 3 years in Okinawa, my life changed as well. We both went to Australia, and I actually started studying visual arts in contemporary art as a master. And my first work, I actually concentrated on to make a lot of tiles featured Australian endangered butterflies. And because I'm really concerned about environment issues at the time, maybe from the child, and I made thousands of butterfly tile and covered the Australian Scientific Museum in Canberra. And I lost my weight to 8 kilos for making tiles in 8 months. And then the exhibition title is called Fumie, and it's the Japanese Fumie tiles featured Jesus on the tiles, and let people step and break them. It's broken in half an hour. And next work, I also concerned about environmental issues when we living in Okinawa. Beautiful coral actually bleached with the chemicals from farmland. And because Okinawa got the largest sugar industry in Japan, and after the typhoon, always the contaminated water to cover the corals in oceans. And then I created the beautiful coral garden, Japanese garden with sugar. It's called Sweet Barley Leaf. And fortunately, this work actually selected as an Australian contingent to Venice Biennale. And I also made the edible works to eat.
Originally, I was actually lecturing in Asian Studies at the University of New South Wales while Ken was working in art. But I also eventually decided to make a life change and join him. So this was our first kind of performance piece together. We decided to do I think you guys are way too young for this work, but maybe some people know about the John Lennon and Yoko Ono work, War is Over If You Want It. It was about the Vietnam War, obviously. So we kind of put a twist on that. We even contacted Yoko and even got an answer saying she was happy for us to kind of play on her work. And our work was, instead of war is over, it's global warming is over if you want it. And we were just trying to make a message that I guess environmental issues seem so big that we feel like we can't change them, but we can. That was the idea. And this was more than 10 years ago. We did a bed in Federation Square in Melbourne. First of all, I was kind of Yoko and Ken was John. But then we decided to do a bit of a gender change, and I think maybe it works better. So I was John and Ken was Yoko. So other work that we then worked together with was working in salt, where Ken worked in sugar before, and then we got contacted by a curator who is interested in working with us, looking at the issue of the Marley-Darling basin in Australia and the issue of salinity as a result of agricultural practices and irrigation and the problems with the river system. Now it's all completely flooding, different kind of Australian weather extremes, but at this time there was a terrible drought. So this is the grapevines, and when the water gets turned off, they were all dying, and a lot of salinity issues in the Murray-Darling River system, and the government started pumping all of the water away from the river system and basically just creating these huge salt lakes around the region to try and stop the salt from seeping into the river system. This is an example of what happens when the salt arises from the water table. And this is the salt that is left over once the salt is intercepted and just kind of left in areas around, away from the river. So we decided to use this salt and turn it into an artwork. We struggled a lot working with salt. It's a really hard material to work with, but we found a kind of secret recipe, and we managed to make a 9-meter-long table completely out of all of that Murray River salt, over 1 ton of salt, and the work is called The Last Supper. So it's about environmental issues and the problems of food security, not only in Australia and not only about salinity, but about environmental impacts in general. And this is another work, was kind of inspired by Crystal Palace of 1851. And we called the work Crystal Palace. And it's chandeliers, but instead of just normal chandeliers, we actually used uranium glass. And each chandelier represents a country, and it's a country that has nuclear power sourced as energy in the country, and each chandelier is based on the amount of nuclear power that is produced for electricity. And we made this work after Fukushima. We were both very impacted by Fukushima, having been born in Tokyo. Ken grew up in Tokyo. So this work was shown actually at the Singapore Biennale, which was created by Bu Hui Tang, who very unfortunately recently passed away. We were very upset about that, but he worked with the Asia Society in New York. So Singapore Biennale. And more recently, we moved, as Ken said, to this kind of a limited village, it's called in Japanese, where disappearing village, where a lot of old people, and we decided to farm. We were looking a lot about environmental issues in our work, and in some ways, I think we felt a bit like we were maybe hypocritical or not really practicing what we preach. So we actually started farming ourselves. And this is Ken hand planting 3,000 square meters of rice paddy. And this is the first meal that we managed to make ourselves completely out of stuff that we had grown. It's very plain, just rice and natto with black beans. And as we were working with the soil, we really started looking into the importance of microorganisms. And up until that point, we had seen environmental issues as something kind of apart from us in a way, I think. Like nature was separate from humans. But as we were toiling the soil, we literally began discovering that our entire bodies are all ecosystems in themselves, and we live together with trillions of microorganisms inside us. And as a result of various practices in the world, all of our balances are breaking down. The balances inside of us, in our intestinal systems. And this is actually a photo of a particular microorganism, Bacillus subtilis, which is natto in Japan. And you can see the organization of the communities, the microorganism communities, is really interesting. How different patterns is how they react to the amount of food that they themselves have around them. This is what this picture is showing. And we worked with some scientists at the Queensland University of Technology, and this is actually a picture of my microbiome saliva in my mouth and all the organisms inside it. And we decided to try and find a work that was related to that. Up until now, as Ken was talking about, he was really interested in coral, and a lot of his work and our work was based around the issue of coral. And we started looking at coral as well as, you know, these environmental impacts were all related to the breakdown of the symbiotic system, a system where coral was totally immersed within an integrated ecosystem of microorganisms and how they were getting affected by environmental impacts, et cetera, et cetera. And our bodies, as well, as I just pointed out, are also a part of this incredibly complex system that is really based around how our microbiome is working together with the rest of our systems within our bodies. And it was totally coincidentally that we were working on this in 2019, which obviously then turned into the pandemic in 2020. And this was the work that we created as a result of this research. It's called dysbiotica, and it comes from the word dysbiosis, which is the breakdown in balance in systems. This was shown in Tokyo in 2020. And this was shown again then in Kadokawa Cultural Museum in Saitama, their opening exhibit there in 2020-21. And this is the exhibition at Kadokawa, and this is the advertisement for Kadokawa, which I thought I'd end it with because it's an interesting title. In Japanese, dakara watashi wa sukaretai, which means in English, that is why I want to be saved. So the question of does art save us? Spoiler alert is probably not. But it definitely also, unfortunately, didn't save the chairman of Kadokawa, who recently was arrested for bribery. Yeah. But so to end on a positive note, I guess that the power of art is in a world of where we're kind of overcome with words and discourse, is that it's something that is not that. I mean, often it's said, you know, a picture tells 1,000 words, but also it doesn't say anything. And maybe that's a good thing. It can be a positive thing because it has a million possibilities at the same time. And I'm quoting René Magritte here, who said, "One cannot speak about mystery, one must be seized by it." And thinking about the power of creative thinking, I guess this is where it is. This is where it lies. And when I'm talking about creative thinking, I often use the example of my daughter, one of our daughters, who, when she went to preschool, there was a whole lot of pictures on the wall of what the kids had made, Santa hats, which was like a red kind of triangle with a pom-pom on top. And hers was the only picture that didn't have a pom-pom. I'm like, why doesn't your picture have a pom-pom? Did you forget to put it on? And she's like, no, mine is not a Santa hat. It's a volcano. And I liked that idea that anything can be something else. You know, the possibilities often in education, I think all of our education is that the teacher tells us to make a Santa hat, and that's what we're supposed to make, and we learn that. But maybe we need to unlearn that a bit and also think of other things that we can make. We can also turn it into a volcano. So art has like a million possibilities. And also for us, art has enabled us to kind of try and reconnect with the environment around us and to bring those connections back into our artwork as well. And to kind of have this idea of knowledge that is not necessarily just about reading a book or looking at the internet, but is also about using all of your senses in the world around you. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ken and Julia. In some ways, it can seem like we're doing very different things, but I think there's maybe a common thread is community. There's something about community, whether it's communities of people who are displaced, communities of coral, communities of laborers who have a voice, but whose voice, when raised, can be very risky. And I want to honor and appreciate the work that Xyza and Ken and Julia do. I think it's brave in many ways, and tricky, but also fun. I think we all have an element of play in what we do, and that art does, invite a very different kind of engagement that is not about, policy and precedent necessarily. It does have its own really icky, yucky, pretentious side, but working as a professor as I do and teaching young people, one of the things I find about working creatively as well is that it really sort of exercises a different part of my brain and gets my students to think in ways that are very different and kind of crazy. And I think we need that. We need that wild brain. We need that way of reconnecting community, of healing, of working through the traumas that we're starting to recognize more. They've always been there. These turbulent tides and turbulent times that we live in, this is nothing new. I think we're just realizing how turbulent it is. And I think that's part of what maybe we're trying to do here. So thank you very much for listening. And maybe I think we have some time for questions and comments. Maybe, yeah. I think you may be first, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that the URL Santa Volcano is not taken, so maybe you can register that. No, yeah, I guess the question is for me. You all have various audiences, and they've had a reaction to your work. I'm just curious. Has anything surprised you by the type of reactions that you've received, something that you didn't expect?
Yeah, the people's reaction is very interesting, especially when I made Fumie tiles, the butterfly tiles. I let audience to break them, but at first it's really hesitated. But one step on and keep going on, then someone put them in the bag to steal. And but interesting thing I saw is only ladies try to save the tiles. So maybe interesting behavior and witness I was to see.
Xyza, did you want to comment?
Oh yeah. I think the most interesting one is when a country banned me from entering their country. I was like, I didn't even do anything. So I think it always surprised me when certain people of power are offended with, well, they're always offended, right? But they react in a way that is, for me, was like surprising. Like my book is banned in one country because they were offended with a certain photo, or I'm not allowed to enter a country because I might photograph whatever human rights things that, human rights violation they're doing. So it's always surprising for me when the people that I'm trying to have a conversation with close the door instead of like, hey, let's sit down. What can we do about this issue? But instead they're like, nope, let me exercise my power over this Filipina girl and close the door. So that is always surprising for me. The good side is it always surprised me when some people who I thought would never allow me to tell their story are the ones who are always excited to share their story. It makes me realize that everyone just want to be heard,
Thank you. I just wanted to add really quickly. I mean, I'm not making art regularly, but as a writer and as someone who is working in that space now, and also, attending art events and so forth, working with artists, what I find really, really interesting and really satisfying is to see how, for example, with the Asia Pacific Triennial in Australia, people who were not considered artists and didn't really have a space to kind of speak are now being, coming from these communities throughout the Pacific in a space where they are actually talking with people who are really big influencers in the art world as well. And in some ways, the art world can be, sort of a lot of champagne and walking around and kind of schmoozing with people. But at the same time, some of these people who are collectors or who are in that art world are very wealthy, corporate kind of folks who also do get influenced and changed and transformed by these conversations. So in some ways, art can kind of transcend from a space of, very local communities where people are really struggling, and there might be a lack of privilege and poverty and so forth, to a space where people are extremely privileged. And it kind of creates these strange confrontations, possibly, but also, as Xyza is saying, I mean, maybe people might be offended, but I also find sometimes there's a space for acceptable subversion, and some conversations happen that wouldn't otherwise. So that's been exciting and very interesting for me. Thank you. Shall we go to you next, I guess? Or I'm not quite sure what the order was. I think you also had a question.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, just a quick question to all those who think they might have an artist lurking inside of them. There seems to have been a key moment when you decided, right? You were an economist and you decided to turn away from that. Just tell us a little bit about that. And you were teaching in New South Wales. So just a little bit on that key moment when you took that plunge. What led you to it?
I was working as a foreign exchange broker for 3 years, from 96 to 99. And at that time, a lot of things happened, like Asian crisis as well. And then second year, I actually moved into the different desk. It's called a derivative desk. And I was trading in between the bankers as a broker, buy and sell the Japanese interests. It's called the yen swap, and it's a little bit difficult to explain in a short word. But minimum amount to $10 million and buy and sells. And then I thought, like a big amount of money with trading, and then oh my God, it's maybe in a next decades crash is going to be happening. Now that we confronting the economic crisis right now, and at the time I was so tired in 3 years, and then I don't know, I was searching means of life, and then I was struggling to find another life after quitting the job in Australia. And then Julia keep asking me, what are you going to do next? And then I don't know. And then I so stressed out, and then searching, like washing dishes in a restaurant. But finally, I don't know. It's kind of fate to create something, and I'm now keep creating artwork, and also I'm working as a farmer, also my fate, and then I'm here, also a fate to tell something. So maybe, yeah, I got asked to come here, and then why, I thought, and then I think about it, maybe I have to tell this. Working as a farmer for 7 years, the climate change is so extreme, and it's hard to grow everything. So I feel this planet gonna be, huge impacted by humankind, and then it's hard to keep doing like this life anymore. And then probably in 10, 20 years, humankind is going to be disappear. But Julia said, talking about microbiome. So as a microbiome level is still going on this planet. So maybe the new kind of intelligence creature is coming up, after humankind. But we have to do something. So maybe, the young leaders are here already. So we actually ask you to do something. Think about the future. Yeah, we are too old.
Yeah, I guess my answer is if you can't beat them, then join them, right? That's why I decided to join Ken, because it looked like he was having a lot more fun than me. But I don't want to say that, because you guys should be leaders. Please don't become artists. But I guess also I should mention that there's another person that joined us all together, and his name was Minoru Hokari, a Japanese scholar, and he passed away from cancer around this time, and it really impacted us. We were looking after him, and it made me think about my own life, and it made me want to create the volcano. Yeah, instead of doing what everyone else had told me to do for so long, which was make the Santa hat. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. Maybe we should go to another question. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have to say, Julia, Ken, Xyza, Greg, what an inspiring conversation this was. I also wanted to ask you, all of you had the courage to follow, paths which are a little different and varied. What are the kind of art ecosystems that allow people like you to take this path and to sort of to be able to dabble in things that you're so passionate about? I think it'd be really lovely to hear about the art ecosystems that support and facilitate this.
That's a great question. So those kinds of ecosystems and channels of, how people can get into this kind of space. I think maybe Xyza would be a great person to talk about that, because you've taken such a journey, Xyza. How do you feel like sort of the art, maybe infrastructure or non-infrastructure, or some of those different pathways have led you to where you are?
I think it's more on because a lot of gracious people open their heart, their resources, and I strongly believe in collaboration. If there's one thing that sustained my art is I found people, organizations like Asia Society, who supported my work and believe in the work that I do. Because, gotta be honest, if we were just, art can be poverty. I don't want to be poor. I was poor before, and I don't want to go back to that. But finding that a lot of people who are willing to finding all these people who have the same value as mine, it's really important in our industry. It's also important to collaborate and find ways to get the meaning, the message across. So that's how I survive personally. And there are other ways, of course, like gallery shows. That's the commercial side of the art industry, gallery shows, collectors, museums, and other stuff. But one thing that I've learned through the years is the power of no, because I say no to a lot of things, and the main reason I say no to a lot of things is because their values doesn't align to mine, and I think that's empowering for my part as an artist, because I've learned that if that institution or this person, no matter how many millions of dollars that person is giving me, if I cannot sleep at night because of my conscience, then I wouldn't do it. So the only way to do that is find people who have the same values as mine. And I found it with Asian Society, to be honest. I'm not kissing ass or anything, but you know, I'm here. Should be sleeping, but I'm here because of that beauty of collaboration. You know, thank you.
Thanks, Xyza. Yeah, I think we have only one more minute, so maybe we can take one more question or a comment or something like that from the audience. I see your hand up. Is that where?
Do you want to go? Quick question.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference maybe in culture as well? Julia, when you were talking, and you were talking about your daughter, and I have two daughters, one's 4 months and one's 5 years, and you mentioned that there was a volcano instead of the Santa hat. My first reaction would have been, you know, you should have put a pom-pom and, you know, it's supposed to be a Santa hat. But what was your reaction? Did you let her kind of, you know, find her own way or conform? And with Ken, I'm guessing that you became an economist because, or you studied economics because your culture or family pushed you towards it. Do you see a difference even with your students, Greg, that there's more of an opening towards being different?
If I could, I'll really quickly address that. With my students, I think I'm really excited about the latest generation. And when I say that, I'm talking about people who are about 18, 19, who are just starting out in university here. I teach in a rather diverse space. And we teach in English at Waseda University in my division, just because we have such a diverse crowd of people. So I get to see people from all over the place, and especially from Japan. But I think in the wake of COVID, actually, there's been this amazing sort of emergence of people that are really frustrated with the way things have been. And so they are looking for something. I don't know if it's always, you know, sort of a conventional sort of art approach, but they're creative, they're seekers. And I'm excited by that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I look around me and sometimes I see the world going in the opposite direction. I'm not
because you're very pessimistic.
I'm not thank you. I'm also not a great fan of the Japanese education system. So when my daughter made the volcano and I heard her explanation, I thought it was so cool. So in that respect, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'm a bit different to. You know, I was born in Japan, but I don't really look Japanese, obviously. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to finish. So thank you very much for your questions and comments. I think we'll be sort of hanging around. Xyza obviously is sort of up there. Sorry you can't be with us, Xyza, but thank you so much for joining from New York. And thanks so much. Hope to see you later.